questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning the Prime Minister was asked what should be the easiest question that a Liberal or Labor Prime Minister is ever expected to answer. And given that the Prime Minister refused to give a direct answer, I ask again, will the Prime Minister rule out weakening John Howard's gun laws as a part of horse trading in the Senate?
The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated in the radio this morning and as I indicated earlier today in the House, there is no prospect, no chance of my government weakening, watering down John Howard's gun laws. And I might say there is no proposal being made to do so. Now, I want to explain to honourable members very clearly what the position is. The National Firearms Agreement in 1996 was one of John Howard's great achievements. It is one of the great prides of the coalition. Under the National Firearms Agreement, honourable members should be aware that lever-action shotguns are listed as Category A, which makes them, subject to the regulations that we have around firearms, readily able to be acquired by people who conform with the necessary regulations. Now, what occurred last year, as honourable members may be aware, that there was a proposal to import a large number of lever-action shotguns, the Adler shotguns. What that meant was that, in the views of many law enforcement officials, that the 1996 National Firearms Agreement, John Howard's gun laws, if you like, had not kept up with technology. There was a need for the Council of Australian Police Ministers, Justice Ministers, the Law, Crime and Community Safety Council, to consider this matter, and the Commonwealth has sought for them to reach consensus and reclassify these lever-action guns. Because there had been a failure to reach that consensus, the government imposed a ban on importing lever-action shotguns of more than 5 rounds. So that was not designed to weaken or vary John Howard's gun laws. It was to hold the ring and prevent those lever-action guns of that capacity to be imported at all. That ban had a 12-month duration. When it came up for expiry, it was renewed, and the minister is working hard to ensure that his counterparts in the states agree on a reclassification of these guns that they can reach consensus on with the advice of their police commissioners. So, to be very clear, there is no chance at all, no prospect whatsoever, no proposal to weaken John Howard's gun laws. What has been identified is an area in his gun laws where there needs to be strengthening, and that is what is before the relevant ministers at the moment.
The member for McKellar.
Question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister advise the House on the importance of re-establishing the Australian Building and Construction Commission? How will the ABCC improve the productivity of work sites, reduce the cost of construction and crack down on union thuggery?
Well done. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. And as if we needed any more reminding, the video that has become available today that shows on a Queensland construction site, for the Commonwealth Games no less, paid for by taxpayers' dollars, you see the threats from the CFMEU.
Member for Perth and the member for Barker.
Displayed. I've got your telephone number, that thug said. I know where you live, that thug said. Do you want your site shut down for another 2 days? That thug said. That is the thuggery that the opposition continues to endorse and protect. Oh, rubbish they cry. Rubbish they cry.
Member for Isaacs.
You've got the chance to vote to bring back the rule of law to the construction sector. Mr. Speaker, we know that the CFMEU regards the law of the land with contempt. They regard the fines that are imposed on them, millions of dollars of fines, with the same indifference as a courier might regard a few parking tickets. They pay no regard to the rule of law, and with this has a direct impact on our economic progress. We are paying 30% and more on these union jobs, not because of any reason other than that they stand over, they threaten, they bully and they intimidate. And what about the way you have favoured contractors? What about the City of Brisbane? Try getting on a job if you're a tiler in the City of Brisbane and you're not on the CFMEU list. If I try that, you won't get very far. This thuggery has to stop. Now, we know what works. We're not being theoretical here. When there was the Australian Building and Construction Commission, disputes went down, productivity increased, the rule of law prevailed, and there is a clear-cut case for reform here. Now, Mr Speaker, it was the opposition leader in 2012 doing the bidding of his union masters who abolished the ABCC. He did that because he had to. He did that because they fund the Labor Party, they control the Labor Party, all of their academics, all of their fine lawyers, all of their pretensions and talk about fairness. How is it fair to have a militant union ignoring the law, standing over contractors, denying people a chance to work, undermining our economic growth? The time for this sectional interest of the Labor Party has come to an end. This parliament must embrace the rule of law and restore justice to the construction sector.
Expired. The members for Perth and Parramatta are warned. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Since coming to office in 2013, has the coalition government or any of its ministers offered or agreed to weaken Australia's gun laws in return for support in the Senate?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer the honourable member to my earlier answer. Not only is there no prospect, chance of any kind of my government weakening Australia's gun laws, by which I assume he means the National Firearms Agreement, but we are constantly seeking to strengthen them. We're increasing the penalties for the illegal importation of firearms. We are standing up against illegal trafficking in guns all the time. That's our commitment. So there is no prospect of any weakening or change to the National Firearms Agreement other than one that in fact would strengthen it. So, let's be quite clear. Senator Leonhelm, the Libertarian senator, as he said today in his doorstop, he is not proposing any weakening of John Howard's gun laws. There is no proposal to weaken John Howard's gun laws. What has been identified is
the member for Sydney will cease interjecting. The member for Corangamite will cease interjecting, as will the member for Bruce, the Manager of Opposition Business, on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, there was an earlier question that asked whether something would happen prospectively. This question asks whether something has happened in the past since the change of government, and the Prime Minister should be directly relevant to that.
Will resume his seat. I've been listening carefully. I believe the Prime Minister is being relevant to the answer.
Well, Mr Speaker, I can speak for myself. I have not been asked. No, I have not been asked, and I don't believe I'm not aware of any minister being asked to weaken the National Firearms Agreement. There has been an issue, as you know, about the import ban, and the import ban, as I said, and was said at the time it was imposed originally, the import ban is designed to hold the ring to prevent the importation of these Adler lever-action shotguns of more than 5 rounds, which, under the National Firearms Agreement, John Howard's gun law, if you like, would be able to are categorised as Category A. So that is what's happening. We are standing up to ensure that Australians are protected and are kept safe And I just think honourable members should be very careful in their desperate efforts to distract from the criminality and thuggery of the CFMEU, to distract from the obligation this parliament has to reinstate the rule of law in the construction sector, to try to latch on to this issue when they know full well that not only do we stand by the National Firearms Agreement, our side of politics established it. This is what we did. This is our claim to this issue. John Howard established the National Firearms Agreement, and we stand by it. And we stand by it. But what the Labor Party does not do is stand by the rule of law. It doesn't stand by the contractors. It doesn't stand by the thousands of electricians and carpenters and plumbers who have to knuckle down to the thuggery of the CFMEU. It doesn't stand for the young couples that can't afford to buy a house because the costs are being pushed up by union thuggery, or taxpayers that have to pay more to build every type of infrastructure.
Prime Minister's time
Mr. Speaker,
has
the
expired.
rule of
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister outline to the House how the government is providing humanitarian assistance to Iraq, especially those affected by the Mosul offensive?
I call the Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning for his question and for his ongoing commitment to global security. Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister said earlier, the government of Iraq has commenced military operations to liberate the city of Mosul from the terrorist organisation Daesh, or ISIL as it's variously called. Members will be aware that in June 2014, ISIL proclaimed a so-called Islamic Caliphate over parts of Iraq, including Mosul, and in Syria. At the invitation and with the consent of the Iraqi government, Australia is playing an important role in Iraq and during the Mosul offensive. As a major contributor to the global counter-ISIL coalition, Australian Defence Force personnel are advising and assisting the Iraqi counter-terrorism service. Our aircraft are providing air support to Iraqi operations, and our personnel have trained Iraqi army battalions that are participating in the offensive. Mr. Speaker, Australia is also providing critical humanitarian assistance in response to the Mosul offensive, recognising that the humanitarian need that will invariably result from this military operation is likely to be significant. Mr. Speaker, today I have announced that Australia's contribution will be an additional $10 million in humanitarian support to Iraq. This contribution will specifically provide emergency food, medical assistance and temporary shelter to meet the needs of Iraqis displaced or impacted by the Mosul operation, and it will specifically support women and girls who are at the greatest risk of hardship. The contribution will bring Australia's total humanitarian assistance to Iraq since June 2014 to $70 million. It is in addition to the $213 million in humanitarian assistance provided to date in response to the Syrian crisis, and recently the government committed an additional $220 million over the next 3 years for humanitarian relief in Syria and neighbouring countries. Australia's committed humanitarian and stabilisation assistance for both the Iraq and Syrian crises now stands at over $500 million. The defeat of terrorist organisations such as ISIL is a national security priority for the Australian government and for our country, as we work to prevent the spread of ISIL's activities in our region and here in Australia. Freeing Mosul from the tyranny of ISIL will liberate the people of Mosul and will take away the false narratives of these Islamic terrorists who must be defeated for the safety and security of people in the region, in our region and in Australia.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Justice. Since coming to office in 2013, has the minister ever offered to weaken Australia's gun laws for support in the Senate?
The Minister for Justice has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And what that question from the Leader of the Opposition shows is that he has absolutely no understanding about the way we regulate guns in Australia. Absolutely no understanding, and neither does anyone else on the opposition front bench, as far as I can tell, from all of the nonsense that has been said about this today. Now, let me go through it. I'll be as precise as I can so you can actually understand what's going on. In Australia, since 1996, lever-action shotguns of any capacity have been classified in Category A. That was the case since 1996, and of course that was the case during the 6 years of Labor government during this period. So during the 6 years of Labor government, all lever-action shotguns, regardless of their capacity, were in Category A, the least restrictive category of licence that's offered anywhere in Australia. Now 18 months ago, it was made known to the Commonwealth through both officials at the state level and law enforcement and our own law enforcement officials that there was going to be a significant import of lever-action firearms with a magazine capacity of over 5. So subsequently, we took action to restrict their import until we could start and complete a conversation with the states about what is the appropriate classification for lever-action shotguns. Those conversations have been ongoing, but they are not yet concluded because we have not yet got agreement between the states. And so we have said that the ban will remain in place until we have that agreement with the states. Now, I'm hopeful that we will get that agreement soon, but the government has been very clear that the temporary import ban is going to remain until that time. Now, anyone who knows anything about community safety and guns in Australia knows that the real issue about community and safety and guns is the illegal firearms market. The illegal firearms market. And of course, we've worked since we arrived in office to restrict the access of criminals to illegal guns. Part of that is making sure that we have tougher restrictions for gun smuggling. We've presented that to the parliament twice, and twice the Labor Party has stood in the way of us passing these stricter penalties for gun smuggling. So there's all this confected outrage, there's all this nonsense about issues that they clearly don't understand, yet they are standing in the way of us having stricter penalties for organised crooks that smuggle in the black market. That is actually the issue that we should be addressing as a parliament. We will continue to make sure that John Howard's very strong, very successful firearms laws remain in place, and we will continue to do the most important thing with regards to public safety, and that is crack down on the illegal firearms market. If you cared about this, you'd join us in doing that.
The member for Denison has the call. The member for Deakin will cease interjecting. The member for Denison has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Ray Williams was a peacekeeper in Beirut during the Civil War. He was shot at and shelled, but had no weapon, body armour or support. He suffers PTSD. Remarkably, though, Ray has been fighting for 18 years to have his service recognised as warlike. Yes, there is a review into service with the Truce Supervision Organisation, but it's been going for years and will likely outlive the veterans. Prime Minister, do you agree everyone injured or wounded in the ADF, wherever they've served, should be given the same high level of support? And will you stop this bureaucratic nonsense, order the UNSO review finalised and help veterans like Ray Williams?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and acknowledge his service in defence of our nation. Mr Speaker, the Coalition is committed to ensuring that veterans like Mr Williams and future veterans and their families have all the support that they need. In this year's budget, the government expanded access to free mental health treatment and support for Australia's veterans to ensure that anybody who's ever served as a permanent member of the ADF has access to free mental health treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, alcohol and substance abuse without having to prove it's service-related. This assistance, as the honourable member knows, can be accessed by contacting the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, the Department of Veterans Affairs is committed to providing support to all eligible members and former members of the ADF who have medical conditions that are related to their service. In addition, medical treatment for a range of conditions can be provided irrespective of whether the condition is in fact related to service. Where a member has a very high level of service-related impairment, the amount of compensation they receive will be the same, regardless of whether they were injured in operational or non-operational circumstances. Now, in 2014, Defence commenced a review of the nature of service classification for ADF service with the United Nations service that you referred to earlier, 1956 to 2010. This review is continuing to work. Through its work, the findings are continuing to be developed, and it's a complex process due to the changing nature of the conflict during this extensive period of time, which makes it difficult to determine the right category to describe the service. This review will, however, be completed by the end of this year. So in answer to your question, the honourable member's question about when will this review be complete, it will be completed by the end of this year. And now, as to Mr Williams' case, I'll ask the Minister for Veterans Affairs to get all of the details from you. He may have them already, and he will follow up that case. And I want to reassure the honourable member and all veterans that the Department of Veterans Affairs will continue to look after them. That is our obligation. We take that very seriously, as I'm sure all honourable members do, because they deserve their own department dedicated to the special needs that come with being a returned serviceman or woman. They put their lives on the line for us. They put their health at risk for us, and we have to care for them. And I can assure the honourable member and all honourable members that the minister is as committed to this as anyone in this parliament and determined to do the right thing by all of our veterans and their families.
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. What is the government doing to ensure all Australians, including the great Australians in Mallee, that they have access to reliable water supply? Is the minister aware of any threats to the effective delivery of affordable and reliable water supply infrastructure?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and I realise that he has a strong understanding of water infrastructure, especially with what we've done with Sunraysia and the capital improvements there that have brought a better efficiency for water, efficiency at the right price. Now, it's very interesting that he'd have that interest, because we're very aware of the Labor Party policy where they want to take $235.2 million from the Water Infrastructure Fund, because they obviously don't believe in building water infrastructure. They don't believe in dams, but they do have a belief in some forms of water infrastructure. Back in 2007, Mr Speaker, when certain individuals were running around telling us it was never ever going to rain again, the Labor government in Victoria chose to build a desalination plant. It was going to cost $2.9 billion. Then it was going to cost $3.1 billion, then $3.5, and then ultimately $4 billion, a 38% increase in the cost of the plant. The proposal was so wild that even the Greens gave up on them, because, as we know, desalination is merely bottled electricity. Now, the plant costs $1.8 million every day now. And, of course, how much water is this plant producing? Not a drop. Not a drop. $4 billion, and it doesn't produce a drop of water. But it gets much better than this, of course, because why just recently Daniel Andrews, Premier Daniel Andrews, has said that he wanted to basically prove its worth, so he ordered $27 million worth of water, 50 gigalitres to be delivered this summer. Now, what we've actually got for this $1.8 million a day where you get nothing is you say, well, how do you get this cost blowout? Well, it was back in 2011 during construction. The CFMEU went on strike and defied the orders of the Fair Work Australia to return to work, and the cost went up to $5 million a day. They went on strike despite the desal plant being affectionately known as Treasure Island by construction workers, given its generous conditions. Conditions so generous that plant workers reported that ice and strippers were made available during midweek parties. The shop steward for the CFMEU at the desalination plant, who had previously been convicted and given a 5.5-year jail sentence for his role in reporting 140 $1.7 million worth of cannabis. Now, I've always thought that the Labor Party needed stronger connections to business, but this isn't quite what I had in mind. This isn't quite what I had in mind. So what do we get? What do we get for the $1.8 million a day for this white elephant? Well, no doubt we know what the CFMEU got, and we know the CFMEU got and has paid for it with a $2.13 million donation to the Labor Party over the last 5 years, and to others, and to the Greens. And for all that, we've got 113 CFMEU representatives before the courts. They stand accused of 1,129 breaches of the law.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Justice. I refer to this email from your office to Senator Leyenholm's office dated the 12th of August 2015 at 10:36 a.m, which confirms the Minister and Minister Dutton, on behalf of the coalition government, agreed to insert a sunset clause on the banning of—
If the Leader of Opposition can just put the email down, he's made his point, and I'll ask you to just repeat the last part of the question.
I refer to this email from your office to Senator Leyenholm's office dated the 12th of August 2015 at 10:36 a.m, which confirms the Minister and Minister Dutton, on behalf of the coalition government, agreed to insert a sunset clause on the banning of particular lever-action shotguns in exchange for Senator Leyenholm's support in the Senate. Does the minister consider it acceptable that he was prepared to trade off John Howard's gun laws in order to secure support for legislation in the Senate?
Members on my right don't need to— Members on my right don't need to yell out time. I interrupted the Leader of the Opposition to get him to put the email down. I'm well aware of the clock. The Minister for Justice has the call.
Yet again, the opposition leader shows he has absolutely no understanding of what he's talking about. No understanding whatsoever. Let me explain to the House. Now, there is nothing new in that email, by the way. This has all been on the public record for a very long time. When we passed the regulation through the Senate to restrict the import of lever-action shotguns with a magazine capacity of over 5 on a temporary basis — this has always been a temporary ban until the states come to an agreement about where to classify the gun — when we passed that, we had a conversation with Senator Leyenholm, and yes, as part of that conversation, we put a sunset clause on that particular regulation.
Minister for Justice will just pause for a second or take a seat. I'm trying to listen to the minister's answer. The member for Gorton and others keep interjecting. I'm going to eject them if that's what it requires for me to listen to the answer. If member for Gorton and others on my left want me to adjudicate on the questions from the Leader of the Opposition, I need to be able to hear the answer. The Minister for Justice has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Now, what happened when we passed this regulation? That was a temporary ban on the import of lever-action shotguns with a magazine capacity of over 5. As part of a conversation we had with Senator Leyenholm, we put a sunset clause on that regulation. This is not unusual. Governments put sunset clauses as a break at any particular point so you can have another conversation about what you might do going forward. That's exactly what we did in this case. There was never an understanding, of course, and the government has always been 100% clear in our position that we will restrict their import until we get an agreement with the states about where they were to be classified. Now, I would have very much liked that conversation was concluded within those 12 months, but it wasn't, so we've subsequently extended the ban until we reach that agreement. It is very straightforward. It is very simple. If Labor had any idea about what they were talking about, then they might just get it. Now, I repeat, Mr
Member
Speaker,
for Lyons can leave
what
under
is
94A.
What is important in terms of public
Lyons will
safety
leave under 94A.
and guns in Australia is that we are as strict as possible on the illegal firearms market. It's the black market for guns that represents the most significant risk to public safety. The reason we have the NFA and the reason that we restrict weapons of a high capacity or of a high calibre is because we don't want those weapons moving from the legal into the illegal market. But it's the illegal market that we need to be tough on if we're going to ensure public safety. When Labor were in office, we of course saw an instance where 200 Glocks were imported through an Australia post office in Sylvania waters. We were determined when we came to office that we weren't going to let that happen, and we were going to crack down on what was important for public safety, which is the illegal firearms market. And we've been stymied in that objective by an obstinate Labor Party that refuses to join with us to get that done.
The member for Bowman.
Thanks, Speaker. A question to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer advise the House on the economic benefits of a strong and efficient construction sector? Look, Treasurer, how does lawlessness and corruption in the building industry risk jobs and add to the cost of productivity-enhancing infrastructure right across Australia?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bowman for his question, because he's well aware of the rather dastardly effect of the CFMEU on building and construction sites all over Brisbane, in particular from his hometown. But the CFMEU's grip on the building and construction industry across Australia is choking productivity. I mean, forget the issue of the union movement per se, Mr Speaker, but if we look at it just simply on the economics, the refusal of those opposites to support the reintroduction of the ABCC is choking productivity in our economy, which is preventing workers from earning higher real wages, from companies, particularly small businesses, earning more, Mr Speaker, and those opposites standing in the way of that.
Treasurer will resume his seat. The member for Perth will leave under 94A. He's been warned. I couldn't have warned him any more. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The lawlessness in the building and construction industry, sponsored by the CFMEU, is putting up building and construction costs, so it costs 30% more and more, Mr Speaker. So that means it costs more to build a school, it costs more to build a hospital, it costs more to build an aged care facility or a road or a port or all of this. It is increasing the cost of investment, which makes investment harder to attract, Mr Speaker, and that's why it's so important that we move to restore the Australian building and construction industry. And it's also driving small businesses out of business, Mr Speaker. Small businesses account for some $66 billion of the contribution to construction GDP in this country. They account for some 70% of employment. So when you read stories like those of Andrew Burke in Queensland, who is a security contractor, and the CFMEU forced him off 5 sites. He was sacked from 5 sites for doing one simple thing, and that was to run security on the site to prevent trespassing onto those sites. And you can imagine who was trying to prevent from entering those sites. He says, "We are a small player trying to grow, but we cannot get any work. We are black-banned by the union. The union boasts that we are going out of business. The CFMEU is out of control," he says. They pressure the builder and threaten to close down sites until they get that control. Now, the Leader of the Opposition, when he's asked about his support for the CFMEU, says, "I reckon I'm on the side of the angels." That's what he says about his support for the CFMEU. Well, more like the Hell's Angels, Mr Speaker. And we all know it was those opposite who renewed the visas of bikie gang presidents, Mr Speaker, and it took this government to cancel those visas, and it'll take this government to restore the rule of law in the building and construction industry.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Justice. I refer to the minister's previous answer, where he explained that the only influence for lifting the ban on rapid-fire lever-action shotguns after 12 months was the negotiation with the states. Why then was he offering, or his office was offering, the sunset clause in return to secure votes in the Senate on completely unrelated legislation?
The Minister for Justice.
Well, I think I just answered that in the last answer. I did. I answered exactly that. I answered exactly that question. I'll go through it again for the benefit of the Leader of the Opposition, who clearly doesn't understand anything about firearms. He continues to ask questions that demonstrate his lack of knowledge about how this actually works. Now, let me explain it again. There was going to be a large import of lever-action shotguns with a magazine capacity of over 5. We had many representations from our own law enforcement officials and from state governments that they were concerned about this import. At the time, and it is still the case, all lever-action shotguns, regardless of their capacity, 2, 6, 8 were classified in Category A, the least restrictive category of licence that is available. When we were advised about the concern about this large-scale import, we took action to restrict the import whilst we had a conversation with the states about where these guns were to be classified. That temporary ban will remain in place until we conclude that conversation. We had a conversation with Senator Leyonhjelm about the regulation that needed to pass the Senate for us to regulate this temporary import ban. As part of that conversation, we inserted a sunset clause in that regulation so it would expire after 12 months, and at the end of that 12 months we would have seen where we were at. My hope was, of course, that the negotiations with the states would have been concluded. They weren't, so it continues that temporary import ban remains in place.
I remind the member for McMahon he's been warned.
This is not a new piece of information. It has been out in the public domain for some time, and Senator Leyonhjelm, of course, has mentioned it many times. In fact, he's released that correspondence on many other occasions, but apparently the Labor Party has never seen it before today. So, let me repeat. We will keep the ban in place. We will keep the ban in place. We will keep the ban in place until the states come to an agreement about where they're going to classify these guns. And you can keep asking me about the sunset clause. The explanation remains exactly the same. And as I said, this is not a new piece of information, but apparently Labor's been completely asleep to do with anything about guns. Now, let me just go through what the record of the Labor Party was when they were in office about guns. They cut the ability of Customs and Border Protection to detect illegal guns coming into this country. They slashed the resources of the Australian Crime Commission by fully 1/3, and the funding of the Australian Crime Commission by fully 1/3, our criminal intelligence agency that helps us detect illegal guns. We will continue to do what we've always done, which is crack down on the illegal market whilst maintaining John Howard's gun laws.
The member for Fisher.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the minister update the House on why restoring the Australian Building and Construction Commission is essential to the creation of more jobs for Australians? What hurdles exist to restoring the rule of law to the building and construction sector?
The Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the member for Fisher for this question, because I know that he, along with all of his colleagues, at least on this side of the House, is absolutely passionate about restoring the rule of law on the building and construction sites across Australia. And the member for Fisher asked me why it's important to reform building and construction in Australia. The building and construction industry, Mr Speaker, employs 1.1 million Australians. It sustains 300,000 small businesses and contributes 8% to gross domestic product. So it's a very important part of our economy. But unfortunately, it could be much more productive if it was not for the influence of the CFMEU and their fellow travellers in the union movement that stopped the building and construction industry from reaching its full potential. The Hayden Royal Commission found that the building and construction industry was riddled with, and I quote, systemic corruption and unlawful conduct, including corrupt payments, physical and verbal violence, threats, intimidation, abuse of right entry permits, secondary boycotts and contempt of court. It went on to say, given the high level of unlawful activity within the building and construction sector, it is desirable to have a regulator tasked solely with enforcing the law within that sector. Yet, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition cannot see any problem in the building and construction sector. As the saying goes, there are none so blind as those that will not see. And the Leader of the Opposition determinedly decides to ignore what everyone else can see before them, which is that the building and construction sector is one of the most unproductive in our economy, and it could make an enormous difference to our economy in Australia and jobs and growth if the building and construction industry was reformed. But there could be a clue, Mr Speaker, as to why the Leader of the Opposition takes this position, which is diametrically opposed to Australia's best interests. There's $11.2 million worth of clues, Mr. Speaker. $11.2 million worth of clues as to why the Labor Party will not stop being shackled to the CFMEU. That is the amount of money that the CFMEU has donated to the Labor Party since the year 2000. $11.2 million. As the Treasurer says, follow the money. And the reality is this amount of money, this enormous amount of money, is stopping the Leader of the Opposition from putting Australians' interests first rather than the CFMEU interests first. But he could prove us wrong, Mr. Speaker, by reversing the Labor Party's position on the ABCC and ROC bills. He could prove that he's not a cat's paw of the union movement by reversing Labor's position and by supporting these bills. And if he does that, I and the Prime Minister will be the first to congratulate him, because that will be putting Australia's interests first.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that he has spoken directly to Senator Leyenhome about the ban on the lever-action Adler shotgun? And has he seen reports that Senator Leyenhome has told Sky News that the Prime Minister was willing to discuss the regulation of the Adler gun in connection with support for the ABCC legislation?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unlike the honourable member who just asked me this question, I respect all of the senators. I respect the crossbench senators, and I respect the views of the thousands of shooters in Australia who have an opinion about the appropriate regulation of shotguns and rifles and other guns. Mr. Speaker, there is a tendency on the part of the Labor Party, as their efforts to distract, to try to misrepresent this issue. Let's be very clear. John Howard's gun laws are absolutely part of our platform, our policy, our commitment. We have not sought to change them. We have not sought to weaken them. Neither, I might say, has Senator Leyenhome. Senator Lights, let me be very clear. The honourable member should listen very carefully. As the Minister for Justice said, and I've said, lever-action shotguns are in Category A and have been since 1996. Because a large importation of lever-action shotguns was forecast, the government, this is the Abbott government of course, took a decision to impose a temporary ban, an import ban on those guns, which means, of course, they couldn't be imported to go into any classification, A, B, C or D, the very restrictive classification. So there was an import ban. That was quite expressly done in order to allow the Council of Justice Ministers, state and territory ministers, who determine the content of the National Firearms Agreement, to come to a consensus on the appropriate classification for these lever-action shotguns. That import ban was continued because such consensus had not yet been arrived at. So, now Senator Leyenhome has a view about what that classification should be, and he's entitled to that view, and he's entitled to express it to me or to any other minister. But what he has not proposed, at least not in my hearing, is any weakening of the National Firearms Agreement as it stands. He has a view, you could say, Mr. Speaker, as to the manner in which it should be strengthened, and he's entitled to have that view, as indeed are other shooters' organisations and their representatives. And the government, of course, listens to those views, as I'm sure justice ministers and premiers in other jurisdictions do as well. So, number one, no weakening, no diminishment of John Howard's gun laws. The 1996 National Firearms Agreement is set there. That's our platform. We stand by it. There is discussion among the ministers about the possible reclassification of these lever-action guns, and we certainly encourage them to reach a consensus. Pending that, the import ban stays in place.
The member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister update the House on steps the government is taking to improve community safety by cancelling the visas of criminals?
the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to say thank you very much to the member for Tangi for his question and his dedication to making sure that West Australians can live in a safer society, and that's what this government is about, to make sure we can take decisions which will make our country safer. And it was an absolutely deliberate decision for us to seek out people who are non-citizens, that is, people in our country on visas who commit criminal offences against Australian citizens, to cancel their visas. And I'm pleased to report to the House that we have cancelled a record number of visas over the course of the last year, but we've only just started. And we will continue to work with state and territory policing authorities and intelligence agencies to identify those at the top of the tree, to work with the policing agencies to identify pedophiles, people who have committed serious offences including rape and murder, and we will cancel the visas of those people because we don't believe they deserve to be in our society. Now, we've taken advice from the intelligence and the policing agencies about those that are most organised in criminal activity. And the advice from the agencies is that those people who are the biggest distributors of amphetamines, that is, drugs that end up in the arms of young Australians who destroy the lives of Australian families, those drugs are distributed by outlaw motorcycle gang members. The advice is very clear, and it's why, over the course of the last 12 months, we have taken action in relation to 106 bikies, members of outlaw motorcycle gangs, and we have cancelled the visas of those individuals. And we will not stop, because we are going to continue to work with those agencies to clean up the sector, to make sure that we can deal with these outlaw motorcycle gang members so they cannot inflict the pain and agony on young children and families around the country. Now, we are not going to be deterred in that process, and it is why Australians look with absolute bewilderment at the Leader of the Opposition, because he is one of the few Australians that supports these bikies so vehemently. And it is an absolute outrage. But ask yourself the question. Well, they can feign all the outrage they want, but ask yourself the question.
The Minister will resume his seat. Minister will resume his seat. Members on my right, members on my left. I was about to say something myself, but I'm going to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Oh, parliamentary language, personal reflections, the list goes on. The minister's completely out of line.
Look, I've been listening. I just want to address the House on this subject. I listened very carefully to the Minister on this subject last week, and I've listened obviously very carefully through question time. And following that point of order last week, I've examined obviously the practice and the Hansard pretty extensively. And whilst we do want robust debate, and I've said that before, and indeed I think Speaker Jenkins probably summed it up best in 2009, where there are issues of cut and thrust in this place. I do say to the Minister that direct link does go beyond the line. It would assist the House if he just withdrew that.
I'm happy to withdraw that, Mr.
Member for
Speaker.
Gellibrand will leave under no.
But if we want to stick with the facts, I mean, the fact is that Labor renewed the visa of a bikie in this country who was known to be involved in organised crime. There are links between the Labor Party, the CFMEU and outlaw motorcycle gangs. That is indisputable.
Members on my left.
That is indisputable. These people are accepting money from the CFMEU in the millions of dollars. The CFMEU supports the bikies because the bikies provide the muscle on building sites. Now, these facts can't be disputed. They've been detailed by royal commissions around the country. And it is a fact, Mr. Speaker, that the Labor Party has taken money and continues to take money from the CFMEU, and the CFMEU have definite links into the outlaw motorcycle gangs. And this Leader of the Opposition, if he was worth anything, would denounce their actions.
Minister, his time has expired. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for Justice. I refer to the email from the Minister's office to Senator Leyonhjelm, which refers to the promise to sunset the ban on lever-action shotguns, and I quote, "In return, Senator Leyonhjelm will vote against the Labor amendment to the Migration Amendment. Please confirm Senator Leyonhjelm's agreement." Minister, how are these issues connected? Why did the government seek to weaken gun laws to secure votes in the Senate on unrelated legislation?
Members on my left, the Minister for Justice. The member for Kingston. The Minister has the call. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And look, you've got to love this guy. He's waving around an email like he's come across some sort of silver bullet. Senator Layenheld has put this in the public domain about half a dozen times before today. Half a dozen times. This is not new information. And the reason that he's doing this, the reason why he's grabbing hold of all this stuff like a drowning man grabbing the nearest life raft, is because he does not want to talk about the Australian Building and Construction Commission, the body that this side of the House believes is vital to restore law and order in our construction industry, the body that will ensure that we have a building and construction industry that is actually productive and world standard, and the body that will stop people working on our building sites being intimidated in the way that we saw in that horrendous video today. That is what is happening here. I've answered all the questions in relation to my dealings with Senator Layenheld and in relation to what we're doing about lever-action shotguns with a magazine capacity of over 5. We will continue to prosecute the case for the ABCC, and we will do that because on this side of the House we believe in the rule of law.
The Leader of the Opposition.
I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House condemns the coalition government for being willing to trade John Howard's gun laws for votes in the Senate.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The Leader of the Opposition.
I move that so much of standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion forthwith. That the House condemns the coalition government for being willing to trade John Howard's gun laws for votes in the Senate. This government would sell out gun laws to pursue their anti-work.
The Leader of the House has the call. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, as this motion was already dealt with earlier today at 12 o'clock and will be voted on at 4:10, I move that the member be no longer heard.
The question moved by the Leader of the House is that the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Aye. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.